Dr. Sarah Chin, had always believed that her work at the Centers for Disease Control would involve fighting ordinary diseases, influenza outbreaks, food poisoning, clusters, maybe the occasional exotic virus. She never imagined she'd be standing in the emergency operations center at 3:47 a.m., watching red dots multiply across a digital map of downtown Atlanta like a spreading infection. Each dot represented a confirmed case of what the media had dubbed acute neurological degeneration syndrome, though Sarah knew the clinical terminology, barely scratched the surface of what they were really dealing with. The affected individuals exhibited complete loss of higher brain function while retaining primitive motor skills and an inexplicable compulsion toward violence, particularly targeting uninfected humans. The first case had appeared just 72 hours ago, a homeless man found attacking a jogger in Piedmont Park with his bare hands and teeth, showing no response to pain or verbal commands. Marcus Rodriguez, a seasoned Atlanta Police Department sergeant, had responded to that initial call, thinking it was just another drug-related incident. 23 years on the force had shown him every kind of human behavior, from the bizarre to the horrific, but nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed that morning. The attacker, later identified as David Kim, a former accountant who had disappeared from his family 3 days earlier, moved with jerky, unnatural movements while maintaining an iron grip on his victim. Marcus had used his taser twice with no effect before finally restraining the man with the help of 3 other officers. What haunted Marcus most wasn't the violence itself, but the complete absence of recognition in Kim's eyes. Not rage, not madness, just an empty hunger that seemed to look right through him. By the time they reached the hospital, Kim had somehow broken free from reinforced restraints and infected 2 orderlies before being sedated with enough medication to stop a horse. The infection spread with terrifying efficiency through the city's interconnected systems. Hospital staff became vectors when they treated the growing number of attack victims without proper protective equipment, not understanding they were dealing with something that could transmit through blood contact and bite wounds. Public transportation became a nightmare as infected individuals boarded buses and trains during morning rush hour, their deteriorating condition masked by the general chaos of urban commuting. Construction worker Jake Morrison had been riding the MARTA train to his job site when he noticed the pale, sweating man in the corner seat acting strangely. Jake initially thought the man was having a medical emergency and approached to help, but the stranger lunged at him with inhuman speed, tearing into Jake's forearm with yellowed teeth. The screams that followed echoed through the subway tunnel as other passengers fled in panic, many carrying the infection to their own workplaces and neighborhoods. Emergency services became overwhelmed as 911 calls flooded in from across the metropolitan area. Firefighter Captain Lisa Park found herself leading her crew into increasingly dangerous situations as they responded to reports of violent attacks in office buildings, shopping centers, and residential areas. The infected showed no fear of fire or injury, walking through flames and ignoring broken bones in their relentless pursuit of uninfected humans. Lisa's team had to abandon traditional rescue protocols when they realized their protective gear couldn't prevent transmission through contact with infected bodily fluids. The normal rules of emergency response meant nothing when dealing with attackers who felt no pain and showed no self-preservation instincts. Television news anchor Rebecca Martinez struggled to maintain her professional composure as she delivered updates on the rapidly evolving crisis. Her teleprompter showed carefully worded statements from city officials about a public health emergency and recommendations for citizens to avoid downtown areas, but Rebecca could see the truth in the raw footage streaming in from field reporters. The infected weren't just sick, they were hunting. Her production crew had already evacuated half the building after security reported multiple breaches on the lower floors. Rebecca knew she might be delivering the last coherent news broadcast the city would see for some time, and she chose her words carefully, trying to inform the public without causing mass panic. Behind her professional facade, she clutched her cell phone, desperately hoping her daughter would answer the call from her college dormitory across town. As dawn broke over Atlanta, the scope of the crisis became undeniable. Military helicopters circled overhead while National Guard units established checkpoints at major highways. The infected had claimed entire city blocks, their numbers growing exponentially as each successful attack created new vectors of transmission. Dr. Sarah Chin stared at the wall of monitors showing feeds from security cameras throughout the city, watching as normal human beings transformed into something else entirely. The red dots on her map had merged into vast crimson zones, and she realized with growing horror that they weren't dealing with a disease outbreak, They were witnessing the collapse of human civilization itself. The real battle for survival was about to begin. The military's containment strategy crumbled within hours of implementation. General Patricia Hayes watched from her command center as her carefully planned perimeter dissolved under the relentless pressure of infected civilians who showed no regard for razor wire, roadblocks, or warning shots. The zombies moved with single-minded determination, climbing over fallen barriers and pushing through gaps that soldiers desperately tried to seal. Her troops, trained for combat against rational enemies, found themselves psychologically unprepared for adversaries who absorbed bullets without flinching and continued advancing even with devastating injuries. The situation deteriorated rapidly when several soldiers became infected during hand-to-hand combat, turning the military's own weapons and training against their former comrades. Dr. Sarah Chin had evacuated the CDC facility and established a temporary command post in an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts. Her small team of epidemiologists and medical personnel worked frantically to understand the infection's transmission patterns while coordinating with scattered emergency services. The data they collected painted a terrifying picture of exponential growth. Each infected individual seemed capable of spreading the contagion to multiple victims before their own cognitive functions completely degraded. Sarah's personal nightmare deepened when she received a garbled radio transmission from her sister's apartment complex, followed by nothing but static. The choice between pursuing her scientific duty and searching for family members tore at her professional resolve. Marcus Rodriguez found himself leading a mixed group of police officers, firefighters, and civilians who had taken shelter in the fortified courthouse building. The structure's thick walls and limited access points made it defensible, but resources were already running low. Among the survivors was elderly Mrs. Patterson, who had been separated from her grandson during the initial chaos, and teenager Amy Chen, Dr. Sarah's niece, who had been visiting downtown when the outbreak began. Marcus faced constant pressure to organize rescue missions for missing family members, but each expedition outside the courthouse resulted in either death or infection. His years of law enforcement experience had taught him to make difficult decisions, but choosing who deserved rescue and who would be abandoned challenged every moral principle he held dear. Jake Morrison's construction skills proved invaluable as survivors throughout the city fortified whatever buildings they could find. His injured arm, bandaged but healing, served as a constant reminder of his close encounter with the infected. Jake had joined a group of survivors barricaded inside a grocery store, where his knowledge of structural engineering helped them reinforce doors and windows against the infected masses gathering outside. The group's leader, a former Army medic named David Torres, relied on Jake's expertise to plan their next move. Food supplies would last perhaps another week, but the infected showed no signs of dispersing. Jake watched through reinforced windows as the zombie horde grew larger each day, their numbers swelling with each failed rescue attempt by well-meaning but unprepared survivors. Captain Lisa Park had transformed the central fire station into a rescue coordination center, using the building's communication equipment to maintain contact with isolated survivor groups across the city. Her firefighting crews had evolved into extraction specialists, using their equipment and vehicles to reach stranded civilians. However, each mission came with devastating losses. Lisa's team had successfully rescued 43 people in the past 2 days, but they had also lost 7 crew members to infection. The captain found herself making impossible calculations about risk versus reward, knowing that every life saved potentially cost the lives of her trained personnel. Her radio crackled constantly with desperate pleas for help from locations that she knew were already overrun. Rebecca Martinez had abandoned the news station and joined other survivors in the city's underground tunnel system. Her journalism background made her valuable for gathering intelligence about zombie movements and safe passages through the city. She had established contact with survivors in other major cities, learning that Atlanta's outbreak was not isolated. Reports from New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles described similar patterns of rapid infection spread and military containment failures. Rebecca's phone finally connected with her daughter's dormitory, but the conversation lasted only minutes before the line went dead amid sounds of screaming and breaking glass. The professional composure that had served her throughout her career finally cracked as she realized the outbreak had reached every corner of the country. As the second day of the crisis drew to a close, the scattered survivor groups began to understand the true scope of their situation. Radio communications revealed that the infection had spread far beyond Atlanta's borders, with similar outbreaks reported in major population centers worldwide. Dr. Sarah Chen's analysis suggested that the zombie plague was not the result of a random mutation or natural disaster, but rather showed signs of deliberate engineering. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through the survivor community, raising questions about who might be responsible and whether any safe haven truly existed. The battle for survival had only just begun, and humanity's enemies might include more than just the Walking Dead. The abandoned Fort McPherson military installation had been scheduled for demolition before the outbreak began, but its thick concrete walls and strategic location now represented humanity's best hope for survival. Jake Morrison's group had discovered the facility during a desperate search for medical supplies, finding it surprisingly intact despite years of neglect. The fort's underground bunkers, reinforced gates, and elevated watchtowers provided natural defenses against the zombie hordes, while its medical facility and armory offered resources that civilian shelters couldn't match. Jake's construction expertise proved essential as he assessed the compound's structural integrity and identified critical repairs needed to make it truly secure. However, the facility's size meant it would require a much larger group to defend effectively, forcing difficult decisions about expansion and recruitment. Dr. Sarah Chin arrived at Fort McPherson with her surviving CDC team and a convoy of refugees she had encountered during her journey across the city. Her scientific background made her invaluable for understanding the facility's research laboratories and medical equipment, but she also carried devastating news about the infection's true nature. Her analysis of tissue samples and government communications revealed that the zombie plague had been developed as a biological weapon, initially intended for controlled deployment against enemy forces. The project had apparently escaped containment through unknown means, transforming from a military asset into humanity's greatest threat. Sarah's revelation created immediate tension within the survivor community, as some questioned whether she might be connected to the outbreak's origins. Marcus Rodriguez led the largest group of survivors to reach the fort, having evacuated the courthouse when zombie numbers became overwhelming. His law enforcement experience made him a natural choice for security chief, but his authoritarian approach clashed with other survivors who preferred democratic decision-making. The conflict came to a head when Marcus insisted on implementing strict rationing protocols and mandatory work assignments, while others argued for more collaborative resource management. Amy Chin, Dr. Sarah's niece, emerged as an unexpected voice of reason among the younger survivors, helping to mediate between Marcus's practical security concerns and the group's desire for personal freedom. Her diplomatic skills proved crucial in maintaining group cohesion during heated debates about leadership structure. Captain Lisa Park's firefighting team had established the fort's emergency response protocols, but their professional training created friction with civilian survivors who resented being ordered around. Lisa found herself caught between her duty to protect the group and her team's growing frustration with untrained civilians who ignored safety procedures. The tension escalated when a civilian accidentally triggered a fire alarm that attracted a massive zombie horde to the fort's perimeter. Lisa's crew managed to contain the situation, but the incident highlighted the dangerous gap between professional emergency responders and ordinary people struggling to adapt to their new reality. The captain realized that survival would require everyone to abandon their old social roles and work together as equals. Rebecca Martinez had taken charge of communications and intelligence gathering, using her journalism skills to maintain contact with other survivor groups and monitor government radio transmissions. Her efforts revealed disturbing information about military units that had apparently gone rogue, abandoning their posts or actively hunting civilian survivors. More troubling were reports of organized groups that seemed to be working with the infected, deliberately spreading the contagion to new areas. Rebecca's investigation suggested that some individuals might be immune to infection, making them valuable assets in whatever larger conspiracy was unfolding. Her discoveries created paranoia within the fort as survivors began to question each other's loyalties and wonder if enemies might already be among them. The fort's resources attracted attention from other survivor groups, but not all newcomers had peaceful intentions. A band of raiders led by a former military officer named Colonel Harrison demanded entry, claiming they had vital information about government safe zones. When the fort's residents refused to surrender control, Harrison's group launched a coordinated assault using military tactics and weapons. The battle revealed that some survivors had already embraced the collapse of civilization, choosing to prey on the weak rather than rebuild society. Jake Morrison's defensive preparations proved crucial in repelling the attack, but the incident demonstrated that zombies were not humanity's only enemy in this new world. As winter approached, the fort's population had grown to nearly 200 survivors, creating new challenges for resource management and social organization. Dr. Sarah Chen's medical research had yielded promising results about potential treatments for the infection, but her experiments required volunteers willing to risk their lives for uncertain benefits. The ethical implications of human experimentation during a survival crisis divided the community, with some arguing that desperate times justified extreme measures while others maintained that humanity's moral principles were worth preserving even in the face of extinction. The debate intensified when they discovered that some survivors showed natural resistance to infection, raising questions about whether these individuals should be studied, protected, or feared. The fort had become more than just a shelter. It represented humanity's attempt to maintain civilization in the face of overwhelming darkness. However, the same walls that protected them from zombies also trapped them with their own fears, prejudices, and moral compromises. As reports of the outside world grew increasingly dire, the survivors realized that their greatest challenge might not be the infected masses beyond their gates, but rather the choices they would have to make to preserve their own humanity while ensuring their species' survival. The zombies surrounding Fort McPherson had begun displaying behaviors that chilled even the most hardened survivors. Dr. Sarah Chin observed through binoculars as groups of infected individuals moved with coordinated precision, no longer the shambling masses of the early outbreak but organized hunting parties that seemed to communicate through guttural sounds and primitive gestures. These evolved zombies showed rudimentary problem-solving abilities, using debris to build crude ramps over barriers and working together to breach defenses that had previously stopped them. Most disturbing was their apparent ability to learn from failed attacks, returning with new strategies that suggested some form of collective memory. Sarah's scientific mind reeled at the implications. If the infection was continuing to evolve, humanity's survival strategies would need to evolve even faster. Marcus Rodriguez had been monitoring the fort's dwindling medical supplies when the emergency call came through their radio network. A group of survivors trapped in Children's Healthcare of Atlanta had been broadcasting desperate pleas for help, reporting that they had nearly 30 children under their protection but were running out of food and insulin for diabetic patients. The hospital's location, deep in zombie-controlled territory, made any rescue mission extremely dangerous. Marcus faced an impossible choice: risk the lives of his best fighters to save strangers, or preserve the fort's security by ignoring the calls for help. The decision became even more complex when Amy Chin revealed that her childhood friend was among the trapped survivors, personalizing a crisis that affected the entire community. Jake Morrison volunteered to lead the rescue mission, his construction knowledge essential for navigating the hospital's complex layout and identifying safe extraction routes. His team included Captain Lisa Park, whose emergency medical training would be crucial for treating any injured survivors they found. They also brought along Rebecca Martinez, whose communication skills could help coordinate the evacuation and whose journalistic instincts might uncover valuable intelligence about zombie behavior patterns. The mission team spent days planning their approach, studying building schematics and zombie movement patterns while preparing for every possible contingency. However, no amount of preparation could have anticipated the horror they would discover at the hospital. The children's healthcare facility had become a nightmare landscape where the infected had learned to use the building's own systems against the survivors. The zombies had somehow triggered the hospital's lockdown procedures, trapping the children and their protectors in isolated sections while infected staff members roamed the corridors. Jake's team found evidence that the zombies were deliberately herding survivors toward dead ends, demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that contradicted everything they thought they knew about the infection. The rescue mission became a deadly game of cat and mouse as the team navigated through darkened hallways filled with infected medical personnel who retained enough muscle memory to operate basic equipment. Captain Lisa Park's firefighting experience proved invaluable as they encountered zombies that had learned to use the hospital's fire suppression systems as weapons, flooding corridors with foam and water to confuse and slow the rescue team. The infected seemed to understand that the survivors needed clear sight lines and stable footing to fight effectively, deliberately creating chaotic environments that favored their numbers and fearlessness. Lisa's team had to adapt their tactics constantly, using emergency lighting and handheld equipment to maintain visibility while avoiding the zombies' coordinated ambush attempts. The hospital's pediatric ward, where the survivors were trapped, had become a fortress within a fortress, with infected staff members maintaining a constant siege. Rebecca Martinez documented the rescue mission while helping to evacuate the children, her camera capturing footage that would later prove crucial for understanding the infection's evolution. She discovered that some of the hospital's security cameras were still functional, recording weeks of zombie behavior that revealed disturbing patterns of adaptation and learning. The infected had apparently observed the survivors' routines and defensive measures, developing counter-strategies that suggested they retained fragments of human intelligence and memory. Rebecca's footage showed zombies using medical equipment as tools, manipulating door controls, and even setting simple traps for unwary survivors. The rescue mission succeeded in saving 22 children and 6 adult caregivers, but the cost was devastating. Jake Morrison was bitten during the final evacuation, his infection occurring so rapidly that he had only minutes to say goodbye to his teammates before the transformation began. Captain Lisa Park made the agonizing decision to end Jake's suffering before he could become a threat to the rescued children, an act of mercy that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The mission's success was overshadowed by the realization that the zombies were becoming more dangerous with each passing day, forcing the survivors to confront the possibility that their safe haven might not remain safe much longer. The children's arrival at Fort McPherson brought new hope but also new challenges. The facility's resources were stretched to their limits, and the presence of vulnerable young people changed the dynamics of every decision the leadership made. Dr. Sarah Chin began studying the rescued children for signs of immunity or resistance, hoping to find clues that might lead to a cure or treatment. However, the mission's true legacy was the knowledge that humanity's enemies were evolving faster than their defensive capabilities, transforming the survival game into an arms race between human ingenuity and zombie adaptation. The massive zombie horde approaching Fort McPherson from the north represented the largest concentration of infected individuals anyone had seen since the outbreak began. Dr. Sarah Chen's surveillance equipment detected over 3,000 zombies moving in coordinated formations, their advance suggesting a level of organization that defied conventional understanding of the infection. The horde had apparently absorbed smaller groups during its migration, creating a living tsunami of infected flesh that would overwhelm the fort's defenses through sheer numbers. Sarah's analysis indicated that the zombies were being drawn by some form of signal or attraction, possibly the large concentration of uninfected humans within the military facility. The approaching army of the dead gave the survivors perhaps 48 hours to prepare for what might be their final battle. Marcus Rodriguez received an unexpected radio transmission from Colonel Harrison, the raider leader who had previously attacked the fort. Harrison's group had been tracking the zombie horde's movement and realized that their own survival depended on stopping the massive wave of infected before it could overrun the entire region. The colonel's message was blunt. His well-armed raiders would join forces with the fort's defenders, but only if they could establish a unified command structure and coordinate their defensive strategies. Marcus found himself in the impossible position of negotiating with a man who had tried to kill him, while knowing that Harrison's military expertise and weapons might be their only hope for survival. Captain Lisa Park struggled with the moral implications of allying with the raiders who had murdered innocent survivors during their previous attack. Her firefighting crew had lost 2 members to Harrison's assault, and the thought of working alongside their killers created deep divisions within the fort's leadership. However, the approaching horde made practical considerations override personal feelings. Lisa's tactical analysis confirmed that the fort's current defenders, even with their improved fortifications, could not withstand a sustained assault by 3,000 zombies. The alliance with Harrison's raiders would more than double their fighting strength while providing access to heavy weapons and military-grade equipment. Rebecca Martinez discovered crucial intelligence while monitoring government radio frequencies that changed everyone's understanding of the crisis. Her intercepted communications revealed that certain individuals possessed natural immunity to the zombie infection, making them invaluable for research purposes and potential future reproduction. More disturbing was evidence that some government agencies had been deliberately exposing populations to the infection while studying immune responses, treating entire cities as laboratory experiments. Rebecca's investigation suggested that the Fort McPherson survivors might include several naturally immune individuals, making their community a target for both infected hordes and government forces seeking to capture immune subjects for research. Amy Chin, Dr. Sarah's niece, had been working with the rescued children when she made a startling discovery that would reshape their understanding of the infection's nature. Several of the children showed complete resistance to zombie attacks, with infected individuals seeming to ignore them entirely despite their proximity. Amy's careful observations revealed that these immune children emitted some form of chemical signal that made them invisible to the zombies' senses, effectively camouflaging them from detection. The implications were staggering. If scientists could synthesize or replicate this natural immunity, they might be able to create a cure or at least develop effective protection against the infection. Colonel Harrison's raiders arrived at the fort just hours before the zombie horde reached the perimeter, their convoy including armored vehicles, heavy weapons, and military communications equipment. The colonel himself was a complex figure, a career soldier who had chosen lawlessness over loyalty to a government that had abandoned its people, but who still retained enough military discipline to organize effective resistance against the undead. His integration with the fort's defenders created immediate tension as two very different survival philosophies clashed. The fort's residents had tried to preserve civilian values and democratic decision-making, while Harrison's raiders had embraced a more ruthless approach that prioritized strength and efficiency over individual rights. Dr. Sarah Chin began working frantically to analyze the immune children's blood samples, hoping to identify the biochemical mechanism that protected them from infection. Her research was complicated by the approaching battle and limited laboratory resources, but she managed to isolate several promising compounds that might explain the immunity. The potential breakthrough came with a terrible cost. The immune children would need to be exposed to controlled zombie contact to test the effectiveness of any synthetic immunity compounds. Sarah found herself facing the same ethical dilemmas that had plagued the government researchers, wondering whether the potential to save humanity justified experimenting on vulnerable children. The unified defense of Fort McPherson brought together survivors who had been enemies just days before, their cooperation born from desperation rather than trust. Marcus Rodriguez and Colonel Harrison established joint command protocols while their respective teams prepared overlapping fields of fire and coordinated retreat routes. The alliance was fragile and temporary, with both sides knowing that survival of the immediate crisis would not resolve their fundamental differences about leadership and resource allocation. As the zombie horde's advanced scouts began probing the fort's outer defenses, the unlikely allies realized that their greatest challenge would be maintaining unity while facing an enemy that had evolved beyond their worst nightmares. The first wave of the zombie assault had been repelled, but the cost was devastating. Colonel Harrison's raiders and the fort's defenders had fought side by side through the night, their combined firepower creating fields of destruction that stopped the initial advance. However, the massive horde had merely regrouped, and surveillance indicated that the infected were adapting their tactics based on the previous night's failures. More troubling was the discovery that some zombies had begun exhibiting resistance to conventional weapons, their bodies showing signs of rapid healing and increased durability. Dr. Sarah Chen's analysis suggested that the infection was continuing to evolve in real time, potentially developing immunities to the survivors' most effective defensive measures. Amy Chen had been working closely with the immune children when she noticed Rebecca Martinez behaving strangely during the battle's aftermath. The journalist had been asking detailed questions about the children's abilities and requesting access to Dr. Sarah's research data under the pretense of documenting their discoveries for future survivors. Amy's suspicions deepened when she discovered Rebecca using encrypted communication equipment that didn't match the fort's standard radio systems. The teenager's growing unease led her to investigate Rebecca's background more thoroughly, uncovering inconsistencies in her personal history that suggested she might not be the simple news reporter she claimed to be. Marcus Rodriguez was coordinating perimeter defenses when he received an urgent message from his police contacts in other cities. The communications revealed that Rebecca Martinez had been flagged by federal authorities as a potential intelligence operative, possibly working for the same government agencies that had been involved in the infection's development. The revelation sent shockwaves through the fort's leadership, as Rebecca had been privy to their most sensitive information about defensive strategies, resource locations, and the immune children's abilities. Marcus realized that their safe haven might have been compromised from the very beginning, with Rebecca serving as an intelligence gatherer for forces that viewed the survivors as test subjects rather than human beings. Captain Lisa Park confronted Rebecca directly, demanding explanations for the encrypted communications and federal connections. Under pressure, Rebecca revealed her true identity as a CDC intelligence analyst who had been embedded with survivor groups to monitor the infection's spread and identify individuals with natural immunity. Her original mission had been to gather scientific data and locate potential research subjects, but months of living alongside the survivors had created genuine emotional bonds that complicated her professional objectives. Rebecca's confession exposed the government's continued interest in the fort's population, particularly the immune children who represented humanity's best hope for developing effective treatments. Dr. Sarah Chin felt personally betrayed by Rebecca's deception, as the two women had worked closely together and shared both professional insights and personal fears about the future. However, Rebecca's government connections also provided access to classified research that could accelerate Sarah's work on synthetic immunity compounds. The moral complexity of the situation forced Sarah to choose between her anger at being deceived and her scientific obligation to use any available resources to save humanity. Rebecca offered to share government research data about the infection's engineered origins, but only if the fort's residents agreed to participate in controlled medical experiments supervised by federal scientists. The discovery of Rebecca's true identity coincided with the arrival of military helicopters bearing federal agents who demanded immediate access to the fort's population. The government team, led by Dr. Elena Vasquez from the CDC's Biological Weapons Division, claimed they were conducting essential research to develop a cure for the zombie infection. However, their insistence on taking the immune children to a secure government facility raised suspicions about their true intentions. Colonel Harrison's military background made him deeply skeptical of official promises, having witnessed firsthand how government agencies had abandoned their responsibilities when the crisis began. The fort's residents faced an impossible choice between potential salvation and certain exploitation. Dr. Vasquez's team offered medical supplies, advanced research equipment, and protection from future zombie attacks in exchange for cooperation with their immunity studies. However, the government's track record of treating civilians as expendable test subjects made many survivors reluctant to trust official promises. The debate within the fort's leadership reflected the broader question of whether humanity's survival justified sacrificing individual rights and freedoms to authoritarian control. Rebecca Martinez found herself caught between her original mission and her genuine care for the people she had lived alongside for months. Her government handlers expected her to facilitate the transfer of immune subjects to federal custody, but her personal experiences had convinced her that the survivors deserved protection rather than exploitation. The journalist's internal conflict came to a head when she discovered that Dr. Vasquez's team had orders to terminate non-immune survivors who might pose security risks to the research program. Rebecca's choice between professional loyalty and human decency would determine not only her own fate but the survival of everyone she had come to consider family. The arrival of government forces transformed Fort McPherson from a refuge into a potential prison, with the survivors realizing that their greatest enemy might not be the zombie hordes outside their walls but the human authorities who claimed to represent their salvation. The battle for humanity's future had become a struggle between those who would preserve freedom and dignity versus those who would sacrifice everything for the promise of survival. The final battle for Fort McPherson began not with the zombie horde's renewed assault, but with Dr. Elena Vasquez's ultimatum to surrender the immune children within 24 hours or face forced extraction by federal troops. The government's deadline coincided with intelligence reports indicating that the zombie masses were preparing for a coordinated final attack, creating a deadly convergence of threats that would test every alliance and principle the survivors had built. Marcus Rodriguez found himself commanding a defense against two different enemies, the mindless infected seeking to devour them and the calculating government forces seeking to exploit them. The irony was not lost on him that both threats viewed the survivors as resources rather than human beings deserving protection. Dr. Sarah Chen made a desperate gamble with her synthetic immunity research, rushing to complete human trials using volunteers from among the fort's defenders. Her preliminary tests with immune children's blood samples had shown promising results, but creating a stable compound that could protect non-immune individuals required dangerous experimentation under battlefield conditions. Captain Lisa Park volunteered as the first test subject, reasoning that her firefighting experience made her best suited to handle potential adverse reactions while continuing to fight. The experimental treatment caused severe fever and disorientation, but within hours Lisa began showing signs of resistance to zombie detection, effectively becoming invisible to the infected masses like the naturally immune children. Rebecca Martinez faced her moment of truth when Dr. Vasquez ordered her to disable the fort's communication systems and defense networks from within. Instead, Rebecca chose to warn Marcus Rodriguez about the government's planned assault timeline and revealed classified information about federal research facilities where previous survivor groups had been taken for experimentation. Her betrayal of her government handlers marked a point of no return, transforming her from an intelligence operative into a refugee seeking redemption. Rebecca's knowledge of government tactics and communication protocols became invaluable for coordinating the fort's defense against the dual threats approaching their walls. Colonel Harrison's raiders found themselves in an unprecedented situation, fighting alongside civilians against government forces that should have been their allies. The colonel's military training conflicted with his growing respect for the fort's residents, who had shown courage and ingenuity that surpassed many professional soldiers he had known. When federal troops began their assault on the fort's perimeter, Harrison made the decision that would define his legacy, ordering his raiders to defend the children and civilians rather than retreat to safety. His choice represented a fundamental shift from the lawless survivor he had become back toward the soldier who had once sworn to protect innocent lives. Amy Chin emerged as an unexpected leader during the crisis, using her unique position as both Dr. Sarah's niece and a bridge between the adult survivors and the immune children. She coordinated the evacuation of non-combatants to the fort's underground bunkers while helping to distribute Sarah's experimental immunity treatments to volunteers joining the defense. Amy's calm leadership under pressure inspired both children and adults, proving that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely sources. Her strategic thinking helped identify weaknesses in the government force's approach, as their focus on capturing immune subjects made them vulnerable to coordinated resistance. The zombie horde's final assault came at dawn, timed perfectly with the government's ground operation in what appeared to be either remarkable coincidence or deliberate coordination. The infected had evolved new tactics during their siege, using primitive tools and coordinated movements that suggested their intelligence was continuing to develop. Dr. Sarah's immunity treatments had created a small group of defenders who could move among the zombies undetected, allowing for devastating surprise attacks against the infected leadership hierarchy. However, the synthetic immunity came with unknown long-term costs, as treated individuals showed signs of neurological changes that might eventually mirror aspects of the zombie infection. The battle raged through the morning as three-way combat erupted between fort defenders, government forces, and the zombie masses. Federal troops found themselves overwhelmed by infected hordes that had learned to use their own weapons and vehicles against them, while the fort's defenders exploited the chaos to strike at both enemies simultaneously. Captain Lisa Park led immunity-treated volunteers in sabotage missions that disabled government communications and created openings in the zombie formations. The fighting was brutal and desperate, with each side making sacrifices that would haunt the survivors forever. As the sun reached its zenith, the tide of battle shifted when several government soldiers abandoned their posts and joined the fort's defense, unwilling to participate in what they recognized as an unconscionable attack on civilians. Dr. Vasquez's research team found themselves trapped between advancing zombies and hostile survivors, their scientific mission transformed into a fight for survival. The convergence of all these forces at Fort McPherson created a crucible where humanity's future would be decided not by grand strategies or advanced technology, but by individual choices about courage, sacrifice, and the value of human dignity in the face of extinction. The silence that followed the battle felt alien after months of constant threat and violence. Fort McPherson's courtyard bore the scars of the three-way conflict: scorched earth where government vehicles had burned, barricades built from zombie corpses, and memorial markers for the 37 defenders who had given their lives to protect the community's freedom. Dr. Sarah Chin stood among the debris, clutching vials of her refined immunity serum that had proven effective in the final hours of combat. The cost of victory had been devastating, but the knowledge gained from the battle would reshape humanity's fight against the infection. Her synthetic immunity compound had successfully protected over 200 volunteers, though the long-term effects remained unknown and would require careful monitoring in the coming months. Marcus Rodriguez found himself leading a community fundamentally changed by their shared ordeal. The surviving government scientists, led by Dr. Elena Vasquez, had agreed to share their research freely rather than continue the failed policy of treating immune individuals as government property. The federal forces' defeat had effectively ended centralized authority in the region, leaving local communities to govern themselves according to their own values and priorities. Marcus's law enforcement background provided stability during the transition, but he recognized that the old models of authority and social organization no longer applied to their post-apocalyptic reality. The survivors would need to create new institutions based on cooperation rather than coercion. Captain Lisa Park had survived her experimental immunity treatment, though the experience had left her fundamentally changed. Her enhanced resistance to zombie detection came with subtle neurological alterations that improved her reflexes and sensory perception while occasionally triggering disturbing flashes of shared consciousness with the infected masses. Lisa's condition represented both humanity's greatest hope and its most troubling uncertainty. The immunity treatments might save the species, but at the cost of gradually transforming survivors into something no longer entirely human. Her willingness to serve as a test subject for long-term immunity studies demonstrated the kind of personal sacrifice that would be required to rebuild civilization. Rebecca Martinez had found unexpected redemption through her choice to protect the fort's residents rather than serve her government handlers. Her intelligence background proved invaluable for establishing communications with other survivor communities across the country, creating networks of mutual support that replaced the failed federal emergency response systems. Rebecca's documentation of the immunity research and battle tactics had already reached dozens of other survivor groups, spreading hope and practical knowledge to communities still struggling against zombie hordes. Her transformation from government operative to community advocate embodied the broader shift from institutional loyalty to human solidarity that characterized the post-outbreak world. Amy Chin had emerged from the crisis as a natural leader among the younger survivors, her diplomatic skills and strategic thinking earning respect from both children and adults. The immune children under her care had become teachers rather than test subjects, sharing their natural abilities with researchers while helping to integrate the growing number of immunity-treated individuals into the community. Amy's vision extended beyond mere survival to encompass the kind of society they wanted to rebuild, one that valued cooperation over competition and protected the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. Her youth provided perspective unclouded by pre-outbreak assumptions about how society should function. Colonel Harrison's Raiders had been transformed into the community's engineering corps, using their military discipline and equipment to rebuild infrastructure and establish defensive perimeters around expanding settlements. The colonel himself had found purpose in constructing rather than destroying, his leadership skills channeled toward community development rather than resource acquisition. Harrison's integration with the civilian survivors demonstrated that even those who had embraced lawlessness during the crisis could find redemption through service to others. His military expertise became essential for training new defenders and establishing communication networks with allied communities throughout the region. The broader implications of Fort McPherson's victory extended far beyond their immediate community. Dr. Sarah Chen's immunity research had been shared with survivor groups worldwide, leading to the establishment of research collaboratives that transcended national boundaries. The zombie infection continued to evolve, but humanity's response was evolving faster, driven by cooperation between communities that had learned to value scientific knowledge over political control. Reports from other continents indicated that similar patterns of community-based resistance were emerging, suggesting that human resilience and adaptability might ultimately triumph over the engineered plague that had nearly destroyed civilization. 6 months after the final battle, Fort McPherson had become the center of a growing network of allied communities that stretched across the southeastern United States. The settlement's population had grown to over 1,500 residents, including refugees from failed government facilities and survivors from overrun military bases. The community had established schools for the children, workshops for developing new technologies, and research facilities for continuing immunity studies. Most importantly, they had created a model for post-apocalyptic governance based on democratic participation and scientific cooperation rather than authoritarian control and resource hoarding. As Dr. Sarah Chen watched the sun rise over their expanding settlement, she reflected on humanity's remarkable capacity for renewal even in the face of extinction. The zombie plague had destroyed the old world, but it had also revealed the strength and ingenuity that emerged when people worked together toward common goals. The future remained uncertain, with new challenges arising as both the infection and human society continued to evolve, but the dawn breaking over Fort McPherson carried the promise that humanity's story was far from over.